Alan Hamilton, who's done a great job so far as monthly program chair, is going to speak to us today about using ancestry.com, the online data, the census, the birthdays, and he's going to review a little bit about his and his wife's DNA. And then he's going to invite us to discuss these matters on the floor. Thank you. Alan?
So I'm going to talk about genealogy and ancestry.com. Let's see if I can. I'm going to do a bit about family trees, a bit about DNA, and a bit about ancestry.com, primarily my side of the family. And then I'm going to talk a bit about my wife's family, who's from the South, and there's some interesting tidbits there. So how do I make this? There we go, I got it. Okay, genealogy from the ancient Greek, genealogica, the making of a pedigree, study of families and family history and their lineages. So family trees were originally for nobility. So this one here, the one to the left is for Louis III. I gotta read this. The Duke of Württemberg, I think he was German. And then interestingly, the one on the right is Adam and Eve. And this was put together, yeah. In those days, there was a lot of liberty as to where these family trees came from. The early British nobles and kings were trying to establish their lineage to Adam and Eve. So suffice it to say, family trees have become more objective now. Okay, genealogy and family trees. Historically, Western societies associated with kinship and the descent of rulers. So that was very important. They had to figure out where the next king or queen was coming from. Interestingly, in China, they have established the family tree for the last 2,500 years from Confucius, believe it or not. So modern times, normal people now have family trees. Alex Haley, do you remember Roots in the 70s? Where he traced his lineage to West Africa, where many of the African Americans originated from. And then finally, Henry Louis Gates, Finding Your Roots. So how many have watched Finding Your Roots? Good, good. So this is like a celebrity family tree, Finding Your Roots, and some interesting things about that. Fascinating show. It's good that so many people watched it. So he traced his DNA to West Africa. Interestingly, he is 50% Irish. Now, it's interesting to note that your DNA can say different things about you, but not necessarily your skin color, as people have found out. Okay, so DNA. DNA is where the record of where we came from is, it's like a map in your body. So it's interesting that all living things have this. So early on, the DNA testing was fairly expensive. Recently, you just pay 50 or 75 bucks, you spit in a tube, you send it to ancestry.com, and they try to tell you where your family came from. So it's pretty inexpensive. So in the 1990s, it became less expensive, so I drink wine. An interesting little tidbit is that how many people have drank Zinfandel? Zinfandel, okay, so in the early days of winemaking, they tried to figure out where wine came from the grapes and the shape of the leaves. And then finally they got around to testing Zinfandel, and they found out that it was directly linked to Primitivo. So anybody from Italy recognize Primitivo? It's Zinfandel. It was brought to California in the 1800s during the gold rush. And it originated in Croatia. So they can trace all these things. DNA. So DNA has, there's three parts to it. The first part is mitochondria. I'll simplify this. It's from the egg, the mother. The Y DNA is the male portion of it, and that's very important because as it's transmitted, there's very few modifications to it. So the male DNA can be traced way back. And finally, the autosomal DNA, which comes from both parents. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to bring up the double helix. You want to, we need that microphone. Well, do this and I'll stay here. We're going to need this later anyway. Hold on, let me do the Genghis Khan first, and then you can do the double helix. Okay, Genghis Khan was the ruler of Mongolia in the 12th century, and he conquered the map that's shown there, Mongolia, China, the Middle Asia, and he made it all the way into Europe before he was repelled. He had hundreds of kids. So remember the Y DNA? When they started testing population groups, they found that Genghis Khan and all of his protege, they would have been princes and well-to-do rulers in various places, started having kids too. Well, as it turns out, his DNA is accounted for in 8% of the Asian population. Pretty prolific, huh? A lot of murmuring here. Okay, so at this point, I'll ask my resident chemist to come up and say a few words about the double helix and DNA and so forth. You ready, Mitch?
Okay, how do you want to do this so that I'm in front of the camera?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So Alan's already mentioned that DNA profiling, or fingerprinting as some people call it, is central to all this genealogy that we're doing these days. Here's a whirlwind science tour of what DNA is all about. You may have heard that DNA is the full name for it is the longest word in the English language, but the dictionary folks don't accept it because it's not a word. But anyway, DNA is a huge molecule, and it is the blueprint for what happens inside of our bodies. And the first thing, it basically is an instruction manual for making proteins and other things. Curiously, all of this complicated stuff, there's only 4 bases that make up the DNA: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And these 4 pair up in a certain way, and they form the rungs in this ladder that we see here in the double helix. And that then gets organized into chromosomes. We've heard about those since we were in school. And there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in your body, including the famous Y chromosome, which makes you a man and thus eligible to be a member of the old guard.
Do we need to test these guys?
No. And I think we got at least one person in the room without a Y chromosome, but that's another whole story. Anyway, DNA replicates, which is copies itself by unzipping the 2 strands, and then each strand builds a new partner. And that all happens in a matter of hours, which is pretty miraculous, a bunch of chemistry happening inside your body. And the key thing is that that replication has to be accurate. If it isn't accurate, all hell breaks loose. So various sections of DNA are called genes, and these direct the synthesis of the thousands of proteins that make up your skin and your organs. Remember in March when we heard about ion channels? All that stuff is proteins that get made at the direction of DNA.
That's so exciting.
If everything goes well, your dad's sperm and your mom's egg become you, and you live for decades, replicating DNA without a care in the world. If things don't go well, we have mutations that generally screw up the system. Good example is Down syndrome. Mutations occur occasionally that actually contribute to evolution, which is also a good thing. Otherwise, we'd all be bacteria running around here instead of humans. Everybody's DNA is different. That's why, you look next to you and the person looks different than you. Turns out that we share the DNA with 98% of the DNA with chimpanzees, 60% of the DNA with fruit flies, and 99.4% with Neanderthals. So that 2% that makes us not chimpanzees vary, and that's why we're all a little different. And going back to the sperm and the egg business, that means that my DNA is half from my father and half from my mother, and going all the way back in the generations that Alan just showed you with those family trees. So the science is relatively new. We had Gregor Mendel and pea plants back in the 1860s. Chromosomes were thought of in the 1800s. The structure of the double helix was in 1953, which is within most of our lifetimes. Sequencing all 3 billion base pairs happened in 2003. That was the Human Genome Project just 20 years ago. You remember that one? It was a big deal. The president announced it and everything. And now it's, you said $50, and the automation in the lab and everything is just amazing. Now it's back to you, Alan. But anyway, it's pretty cool stuff, and I hope I didn't bore you too badly with that stuff.
Good. So Mitch, let me get this straight. We share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, right? Are any of those chimpanzees in Washington, D.C.? No.
No, but they're going to vote in November.
Okay, so what happens is that you can get a genealogical DNA test, that double helix and all those A's, M's, I forget the letters. And then what they do is they figure out from the analysis where you potentially come from. So what happens is that it's cheap. They have a database that they keep track of markers that are in there, and then they try to link you with certain groups that they know that these markers came from. Okay. This is, I know you can't read this, but this is a family tree of two individuals, mothers, fathers, great-grandfathers, great-great-grandfathers, and the amount of DNA that you share with them. So the further back you go, it becomes a fraction of a percent. Your mother and your father, 50%, and then 50%, 25, 12.5, and then second and third cousins. Now, what happens is that it's when you think of a second third cousin removed in 0.02% of DNA, they can still match them with you if they've been tested and they're in the database. So with your DNA, they can find second and third cousins removed. So on finding your roots, Carol Burnett had some doubt about her grandfather on her father's side. There was a confusion. She didn't know. So they did the testing, and they found a link with the maternal side of the grandfather, and they finally, through records, showed her what her real grandfather was, believe it or not. Okay? Ethnicity estimates. So they can figure out where you're likely to come from, but there's doubt about how accurate this is. So scientists would say that this ethnicity stuff is BS, that there's very little doubts of it. However, I'll show you my tests, and I know my background on my father's side, and I know where all these guys came from. So my impression is that it's about right. They can get the continent correct, except for the Americas, Native Americans, and Asia. So they can figure out that you come from Europe and places like that. But in terms of Germany, Norway, and places like that, there's some doubts. So, but nevertheless, they do the testing, they give your profile, and you have an indication of this. So some of that's pretty good. The drawbacks, cost, privacy, some of these people keep samples. They keep samples of your DNA. So there's some questions about whether or not that's correct, and that it's a privacy issue. If you had stem cells, it screws it up. They test identical twins and they come up with different results. Identical twins, identical DNA. So if they're so good, why don't they get a bullseye on identical twins? They don't. Okay, so this is my profile. 54% Irish, 38% England, and a couple of other percent. So what I'm going to do now, so I'm going to quiz you guys. You ready? Okay. Can you hear me? Am I on? Okay, so I need to figure out where you believe your ancestors came from. Okay, so let's get the big ones out of the way. Ireland. Ireland. Really? I would have thought there would have been more. Okay, that's fine. Italy. More. Europe. Okay, so let's narrow it down in Europe. Germany. Well, a lot of Germans. So a lot of Germans came to the US in the 1800s, the 1860s. Does this ring a bell? It was true with my mother's family. So let's do some other countries. The Netherlands, couple, Spain, Portugal. No Portuguese? None of you guys from the Iron Brown section? Okay, so now, does UK? Yeah, UK, sorry, UK. France, good. DJ, did you put your hand up? There he goes. So now, I need to find out if there's an interesting country that you know your family's from to sing out. So raise your hand, I'll come back, or yell it out. Romania. Slovakia. Poland, good. Austria-Hungary. Sweden, good.
15% Taino, 15% West African.
Taino? Caribbean Indian, excellent. Okay. Okay, Miguel's given us the whole profile. Good, good. Okay, so Norway, good. I'm 1% Norway. Hungary. Estonia, good, a Baltic country. Latvia. Canada. Canadians? I'm sorry, I always think of Canadians as our cousins, you know? Yeah, I did Italy. Okay, and did I miss any countries? Russia, good. People from Russia kind of keep it quiet these days, right? So I was in my physical therapist, and there was a lady there, and I was doing my physical therapy, and we're talking. She's from Eastern Europe, and we're chatting. And she goes, oh, I said, where are you from? She goes, Russia. And she described it, and I know the geography, and I said, listen, lady, you're not from Russia. You're from one of those little republics in the east. If I was you, I'd describe that as where you're from, not Russia. That's right, that's right. Ukrainian, Mark's from Ukrainian. Okay, good. So you get the idea. Yeah, we had a Poland.
Alejo has his hand up. Where's he from? Come on.
Okay, go ahead. Alejo, where are you from?
uh, Canada, and then parents came from the US and Finland.
Oh, Finland, good. How many people have done ancestry.com? Good, a lot of people. So you got your profiles, right? That's good. So American Genealogy Company based in Utah by, I think they were originally Mormons, largest for-profit genealogy company in the world. They have a lot of records. So not only do they have the DNA records, but they got the census records, and I'll show you something shortly from my family. And this was in 2018, and I think they have as many as 25 million subscribers now. So you ancestry.com people, have you been digging into it? Yeah, anything interesting? In a few minutes, I'll tell you about my wife's family's slaves. This is my family. Michael Hanlon came from apparently London, although I doubt that. He changed his name to Hamilton. So he came to Brooklyn in the 1860s. So why do you think he changed his name from O'Hanlon to Hamilton? Yeah, discrimination. So it was the Germans before that, the Irish in the 1860s, and the Italians in the 1900s. And I suppose it's the Islamic people now, right? And Hispanics. And Chinese. So everybody's got their turn to be discriminated against. Okay, so my great-grandfather, Alan J. Hamilton, grandfather, Alan W. Hamilton, he was a plumber in Brooklyn. Nice guy. Alan J. Hamilton, my father, and me, and all the Allens are buried in one plot in Greenwood Cemetery, which is kind of interesting. My great-grandmother bought a plot, and all the Allens are there. It's kind of cool.
Where does Alexander fit into your family tree?
He doesn't. I'm an O'Hanlon.
I know, but what's he? He could be too.
Well, I don't know. When I hang out with people that I want to impress and they ask me with Hamilton and they ask me about that, I said, yeah, I think so. My mother may have found that, you know. Okay, here's the original guy, Michael. I found his obituary on ancestry.com, the picture I had, and it described him. I think it's the same guy by the look of the beard, right? And then this is the profile from ancestry.com. When he signed up or registered with the census, he said he was from London. So I have a little doubts about that. Maybe or maybe not. In any case, when he got here in America, he's changed his name, so he wasn't real proud of being Irish. Okay, this is Alan Joseph Hamilton. This is a picture of Eva Hamilton. She was the one who bought the plot in Greenwood Cemetery. Well, I actually have the title. And then this is the 1915 census record that includes his name. Now, I didn't go in here to try to find it, but you can if you want. So they scan all of this. Anybody find census records on your relatives? Yeah, okay, good, good, good. So did you actually go in here and find the name? Yeah? Guess you got to enlarge it and hunt, right? Okay, Alan William Hamilton. This was my grandfather. And this indicates the sons, Alan James Hamilton, my uncle, Edgar. I'll go through these a little quicker. My father, it includes me, my sister. Okay, let's get, okay, what's happening here? Okay, it includes information about their marriage in Long Beach, California. So my parents were in World War II. They were both officers. They met in California, got married, and then my father fortunately came back, and in 1949, I was the product of this. So, okay, good. This is a little bit about my mother's side of the family. So my great-great-grandfather was Jacob Gelbaugh. My mother was Harriet Gelbaugh, but the spelling's a little different, but it shows there's a connection. So somehow they changed the spelling. I don't know if it's when he arrived that the census people spelled it that way, and then they later found out the correct spelling, according to the Germans. So they were from Illinois. A lot of Germans in Illinois and Wisconsin and places like that. Okay, on my mother's side of the family, there was a guy that kept records there. He has a whole directory of the family, the Gelbaugh family. My code here is 5-186. My younger brother is 5-81. It shows my wife, it shows my brother's daughter, and then my sister and her husband. So he kept simple codes. The Jacob Gelbaugh, it was numero uno, 1-1, I think, and maybe the wife was 1-2. And then you can see up at the top there, one of the other ones, the fourth generation, George Gale. He had lots of kids, very prolific. Not Genghis Khan, but very prolific. This is an image I found of the Gelbaugh family reunion. This is quite a group, isn't it? This was probably the 1900s. A lot of guys with cigars. I think we have the kids lined up from youngest over to maybe the oldest. And then some of them don't look like they're too happy about being there. But, you know, hey, this was the early days of photography. And I found it online. These sorts of things are put in there by people. They aren't in the public record. Oops, went the wrong way. Okay, that's me. What I have to do is add my spouse and my kids. So when you guys went on with your information, did you have to add content? Maybe spouses. You can make connections. You can see the connections, and if you know it, you can click on it. Okay, so that's it. So what I'd like to do now, if you have comments, questions, or interesting stories. Interesting stories.
No, just a question. From Ancestry DNA,
Right.
I got myself on it, and every once in a while I get stacks of emails saying we have found a relative of yours, and it comes up with a name and a person who I never heard of, a name I never heard of. It says like a third cousin. Now, knowing the size of my family, yeah, it could be a third cousin, but there's no way of checking any of this, because if you look at the details, they have a tree with maybe two people on them and their spouse. Do you run into that? And what do you do about it, if anything?
Yeah, well, so the connections are through records, census records, and they're definitely links. So mine was pretty easy, Alan Hamilton. So yeah, and then people add things. So this Michael Hanlon / Hamilton, he was there, and I actually confirmed that he was my great-great-grandfather. So I did that, and it's part of the record.
So on a slightly weird note, I learned from, I watch a lot of documentaries, and one of the documentaries I watched was about a serial killers. And
Oh, where is this going?
well, it does relate to what you were talking about. So there was a guy who had killed multiple people and hadn't been caught, and he had put his DNA into 23andMe or one of these sites, and then he was caught. So if you've killed anybody and you haven't been caught, don't do this.
That's true. So, no, he's right. The most famous one, I don't recall the name, but it was like a 25-year-old unsolved murder, right? Yeah. And there were some questions about privacy at the time.
Thank you. Your heritage came to the United States around 1860. As the beginning of the Civil War, there were many, many Irish regiments. Did you find any connections with your family with the Civil War?
Civil War? No, basically. What I first understood was that Michael Hamilton, the deal in the Civil War was that you could pay someone to take your name and go fight. So that's what I originally thought. So I was at some national park and told a park ranger that, and he says, maybe, but he says the most likely reason was discrimination against the Irish.
My question is, how far can you go back? I noticed on your records about 1817. My family is all from Scotland, so it's fairly compact. So we go back, I think we can go back reliably to about the 1720s. That is as far back as we can go. I'd be interested if anybody else can go back further.
Yeah, so you guys who did the research, what's the furthest back you got? Anybody get into the 1700s? Oh, we've got at least 3 or 4. 1500s. So the records then, so were they bishops or kings or something?
So my wife's side.
Interesting. So on Finding Your Roots, there was a lady called Nicey Nash, and Gates traced her ancestors' 4th great grandfather to Virginia. Now, in those days, remember that African Americans were property. When they got put on the census, it was for slaves. So to get back to my wife's story, she came into the kitchen one day and she said, oh, Alan, I got bad news. I said, what? She says, well, one of my ancestors had a slave. So I said, okay, so a week later she comes in and she says, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I said, what happened? I found one that had 12. So I said to her, listen, your family was from North Florida, your father was from North Carolina, and that was what happened, you know? So I don't know if I helped or not. Miguel? Sure.
Well, I'll answer your question with the comment. My wife goes back to William the Conqueror, and that is through a document in her family that was written, and her great-grandfather was the Duke of Bedford, and her grandmother was Lady Portman, and and no, I'm sorry, she goes back through the Duke of Bedford, but her great-grandfather was Berkeley, Lord Berkeley. Anyway, and she married me. I don't know.
Sir Miguel?
Huh?
Sir Miguel? Did you get any of the title?
No, I do have a coat of arms though, from the Registry of Heralds. In any case, and mine goes back to, as I mentioned, Taino, and I did it through 23andMe, which is the other DNA company. And the female, the matriarchal DNA is like the other side of the triangle. The father goes down one way, the mother goes down the other way. My mother's DNA goes back 26,000 years. So she's a descendant of the people that crossed the Bering Strait. Anyway.
Do they have records?
Well, they can trace the DNA. The DNA are classifications. There are DNA classifications, and they can tell where they originated from.
The markers.
The markers, yeah. Anyway, so I was going to ask you, do you know of a difference between 23andMe and Ancestry.com? One more thing. I did go through Ancestry, and I found the boarding pass that I used when my mother brought me here in 1953 on Eastern Airlines. But anyway, yeah, the boarding pass. And I found my grandfather's military draft cards and whatever. Anyway, 23andMe or Ancestry?
Yeah, no, sorry, I do not have any information on 23andMe. But how many people here have 23andMe, did 23andMe? So what I've just showed you, does this ring a bell? Did you find records, census records, draft cards, boarding passes? Yeah? Oh.
But I have a sort of sideline question for you.
Okay.
When you're talking about the ancestry, I'm surprised you didn't mention the role of the Mormon Church in the study of ancestry. Do you know what it is?
A bit, yeah. Do you know what you want to?
Well, yeah. Before, really before the internet era, before DNA testing, the Mormon Church took it upon itself. Well, first of all, to be resurrected, to be accepted into heaven, you have to be a received member of the Mormon Church. Yeah. And
be in the club.
You had to be in the club. But, you know, the Mormon Church hasn't been around since the beginning of time. It was sort of established way back at a certain point in time. But people want their ancestors to be there in heaven when they get there. And the Mormon Church had declared that you could retroactively have your ancestors received in the church if you can identify them and you can go through the process and get them received. Therefore, it behooves you to look up all of your ancestors. And they did this with a vengeance, members of the church, before there was DNA testing. And the Mormon Church took it upon itself to create a vast database of ancestry information. And of course, it's not just for Mormons, because you know, these ancestors are also our ancestors because of all of the mixing. And they bought the biggest computers and the biggest, disk drives, and they filled these things up, and it's quite amazing. So there's this vast store of highly accurate ancestry information, which informs all of the current. I'm sure it correlates with all of the ancestry.com, et cetera. It's a great job they did.
Yeah, so my My wife's side of the family, the father was part of the church. So he was a member in good standing, and the Mormon church did good things for him because he had problems in his life. He had to medically retire at 35. So the church, so I'm on the registry to get into heaven because of him, for what it's worth. The Mormon church was also criticized because they signed up all these Holocaust victims, right? They got heavily criticized for putting them on the list for inclusion. So the Jewish organizations had a few things to say about that, both mostly like, why are you doing this? But, yeah. Can we get an online one? Hold on. Okay, who's online? Al Aho, from our Summit Ogard representative from North Carolina. Al, I want to make sure that you registered in North Carolina because it'll probably raise the average IQ there.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but ancestry is a fascinating topic. And I've wondered if we take all the people who are living on the planet Earth today and ask, who is their first common mother, the mitochondrial Eve of current humanity? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I only know from my reading of science that humans, as we now know it today, came from Africa, right? Central Africa. They came up through Europe, they passed through Asia, they came across to the Americas. So that's all I know in that regard. Does anybody else have any observations? Okay.
So does that mean that we're all related?
Yes, we're all humans. And then we're related to the chimpanzees too, which is obvious in some cases.
This is about a revealed family secret.
Oh, good. Does your wife know?
And at the end, I have a question for you in terms of an ethical matter. A woman contacted me because I was on Ancestor and also 23.
Okay.
And she introduced me to the whole idea of the measurements of, you must know them.
Is this a family tree of some kind?
It's centromorgans. It's a way of measuring. Well, anyway, the thing is, when I was growing up, no one ever mentioned my maternal grandfather.
Okay.
I was raised in a family that was Irish on one side, Italian on one side, English, British Isles on the other.
Okay.
We had big dinners at the dinner with the Italians. Nobody ever talked about the grandfather of my grandfather, biological. Matter of fact, they didn't even talk about the grandmother. They had kind of banned her. So here's the summary. A woman who was trying to find the father, because she was adopted, went on a search. She narrowed down 6 men who could possibly have been one, and then narrowed it down enough to identify that I had more of a match with him than any others. So,
Did she
all right,
contacted you?
my great-grandparents are your great-grandparents, she told me. So we have cousins. Now, I have a son who lives in San Diego. The closest to him is a cousin, second cousin, that lives in San Diego named Doyle.
Okay.
Do I dare let him share this information with young man Doyle? Why interrupt that guy's life with a secret they may have been keeping?
No, but I mean, if you're related, did this guy, was he a serial killer or something? Knew nothing. Well, but that's okay. It's okay to connect. So Carol Burnett, she didn't know who her great-grandfather was, or grandfather, sorry. And then they helped. So the answer is, I would encourage you to consider contacting him and tell him, yeah, we're related.
Well, I give it to my son because he lives in San Diego, same place. He's a lawyer. They know in the same group.
Oh, the lawyer's good. He'll know how to phrase it.
But anyway, it's quite a secret, and it explains a lot of those conversations at the dinner table that occurred and did not occur.
Yeah, I know. Maybe the couple got the Italians pissed off and they outed him or something, you know?
Yeah, so I have a story that is sort of from A to Z. I grew up in this area in Westfield, and I knew nothing about my family. It just wasn't discussed. And then Alex Haley did the Roots thing, and now I'm 25 years old, whatever I was, and I was really interested. So all I knew was that my father had visited an uncle of his in Danbury, Connecticut, who was a painter of some renown. He had painted FDR. He wrote a book about FDR. He painted Joseph Conrad and a bunch of other guys because he spent a large part of his career in England. So I was really struck by that. And he had given us a couple of paintings of his, one of which was of my father as a child. Another was of my great-grandfather. Had no idea who he was. So I tracked down, I knew my father was from Springfield, Ohio. And I knew that he and his mother and his siblings had left Springfield when my grandmother divorced my grandfather. He apparently had a drinking problem. And, in those days, you didn't talk about that. And my father actually had to testify against his father in court. And my grandfather told him, just tell the truth, son, don't worry about it. But that really scarred him, so he didn't want to talk about anything. I had to go to Springfield, Ohio, and that's where my father grew up, on business. And I made a point of finding somebody in the Tittle family who was interested in this, had the old family tree in the old way. And I went out there, I had dinner with these people, and they looked like me. I mean, with these ears, I had never seen someone, except Y.A. Tittle. He had the big ears too. So in this way, I was able to connect with these people. And one of those people was a childhood, when I came back and told my father the story, one of these people was a childhood friend of his. It was a woman. And he was delighted, my father. And he went out there and visited her. And so that's the kind of the mystery story before Ancestry.com, where I found my roots. It meant a lot to me. The other extreme is my wife. But there's an interesting angle here. She had a book called, her maiden name was Way. She had a book called The Ways of Yesteryear, written in, I think, 1930s. And that book had the Way family going back to the 1500s. They were the British. But the interesting thing about it was, if you weren't the first son, all the other sons, they had to come here. Or, a lot of them did because they had no independent income. And a lot of them came through Canada. And then they ended up in the States. And I've never been able to trace the family because of this Canadian-US connection. So her family, I have no idea. I know more about my family, who came here in the 1700s, 5 brothers, Tittle brothers, if you can believe it. One of them went south and became Y.A. Tittle's another one to Springfield, Ohio, and so forth. So it was really interesting to me because I didn't know who he was, and now I do.
Great, thanks, Bill. We're going to have one online. Go ahead.
Hi. I did a lot of ancestry.com, and I traced my father's family. My grandmother actually had a very deep family, shall we say. I found a soldier in the Civil War, fought for the Union. I found somebody who fought for the Revolution on the side of the colonists. And that side of the family I can trace back to the early 1300s in England. Various lords and ladies that running around there. It was pretty interesting. But I was curious about the, you mentioned about the Germans that came over. On my mother's side, they changed their name when they came over because they were afraid they were going to, the person who came over was a draft dodger from Bismarck's army. And he was afraid that they were going to come get him, so he changed his name.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, so we had World War I German draft dodgers coming over, which is fine, you know. Okay, so next, Mike?
Mike. Hi. I started doing my family tree back about 15 years ago, traced both my mother's and my father's side way back. Then about 6 or 7 years ago, decided to do the DNA test. Surprisingly, I got on an email a second cousin and a bunch of third cousins. So it turned out this second cousin was a guy in Australia. So we started to communicate, trying to figure out the connection. We could not figure out the connection, going through every name under the sun that was a match. And because in second cousins, it means we have the same great-grandfather or grandmother. And, but we were all over the map. Then back in about May, he contracted Ancestry to do further research. He paid them. And they contacted me, got permission to access my records. So they worked on it for him. Then now, I always believed my grandfather, I have documentation, my grandfather was George Flanagan, my great-grandfather, Timothy Flanagan. So one Sunday morning, back in October, I opened up my email and it says, and he forwarded some results from Ancestry. Says your mother, your grandfather is not Timothy Flanagan. Now, because of the Flanagan name, I made the assumption I was a quarter Irish. When the DNA came in, it was only 5%. But I figured, well, there's still a lot of connections between Ireland and England. But it turned out that there's these two Rees brothers from Wales who, during World War I, were running around London impregnating young girls. So this guy, one of the Rees brothers, was the grandfather of Don Hart in Australia. The other Rees brother was my grandfather.
Now that's a family secret. That's
no longer. Well, what I'll never know is, did George Flanagan know that he was not my mother's father? That we'll never know. And the other thing is that through the DNA, I think without some additional people having their DNA test done, they cannot determine which brother was which. is one or the other. But I turned out to be quarter Welsh, not quarter Irish, which I believe for all 84 years.
So I had a question. So one of these relatives paid Ancestry.com an additional fee to do all this research. Do you recall how much he ponied up for that?
No idea.
Okay, I think it's multiple thousands of dollars.
I think it's a lot of money. In fact, I couldn't even ask him. Within weeks of him doing this, he died of cancer. So
That's a pity. So what they do is you pay this additional fee. I read in passing that it may be $3,500. And then they go in and they actually match the DNA and the potential and the relationships. So they can tell whether it's cousins, how many removed, or that sort of thing. So yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to have another online. Who we got here? Walter.
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
My wife's into genealogy, and actually she's online watching this. Back in the 90s, she took an active involvement. It was mentioned about the Mormon Church. They went through all of Europe, through all the city records, and a lot of times city records were burned, so they went to church records. And there's a place on James Street in Morristown where the Mormons have their repository of all that data. And I've been there, and I think they have it on microfiche at the time I was there. And I was able to find my grandfather, but not my father. So, anybody that wants to expand their genealogy research, they should check out the Mormon data center on James Street.
All right, so let me ask, has anybody gone into the Mormon records? Anybody got access to it? You got access to the Mormon records? Well, I'm asking people who actually. All right, so tell me about the Mormon records.
Well, it's just, you go out. There's a website, familysearch.com. You register, it's free. It opens up all the records that are available online. You just go out there and you follow the search criteria. Nothing, they just register you, you just put name, email, and stuff. You don't have to enter any of your information. It just gives you total access to everything that's out there. And a lot of it is duplicated elsewhere because a lot of other places take information from the Mormon. They share. Well, they don't share, they steal. But, even the census records, and I remember when they would do the 1950 census came out, public, and the Mormons actually arranged to have those records I'm not quite sure what they call it, but essentially indexed so that you can do a search on them, because the way census records are from all over and they're not searchable in the way. So they had volunteers would go out and they would get sections of the census records. You would take, say, pick a city, you say maybe, New York City in New York State, and it would come up with census records for part of New York City, maybe whatever. And you would go through and you would read the records and you would essentially type it into another form that would then eventually be what would be searchable. And doing that, of course, and I was doing that, and I found out some very interesting things. One of which was I was on the 50 census record because I was born in 1948. Where I lived, the street I lived on was illegible. So I copied it over wrong, and I got to go back and correct that. And not only was it illegible, it no longer exists because this was post-war, and the section, this was in Brooklyn, the section was Army barracks at the time, and the streets were whatever. And since then, it has been turned into a park, and all the streets have been eliminated. So the street doesn't exist anymore, which is why I couldn't find it at the time and got it translated wrong. Since then, I have found a map that had the thing, it had the street, it showed me where, and I found the building. No picture of the building, this was just a map, but it had the correct street on it, so I got to go back and somehow contact the Mormons and say, hey, this is not what I wrote, it is something else.
good.
But
You got it right.
it took about
Thank you.
4 months to get it right.
So on ancestry.com, those relatives of mine, the addresses where they were born is showed on a Google map. So it'll pop up. They all came from central Brooklyn, like 10th Street, 8th Street, so it was downtown Brooklyn. So next, we're going to have Janet online. Janet, you need to unmute. There
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Walt's wife, and I started way long time ago, way before Ancestry was even started, before any of these online sites were started, and I did it the hard way. I had a very large family, and my grandmother had done some research, and you could start with that. But I went to, actually, when Walt and I went on vacations, camping vacations, we would stop in little towns, and I could go through the libraries where I knew
Right.
my ancestors may have lived, and I could go through, they have books with copies of newspaper articles that would be of interest. I found one of my great-great-grandfather who had migrated from New York State to Michigan. And there was a note in there saying that he had joined a bunch of people to go to the gold fields, and he had died on the way of dysentery. That's the only way I would have found that. And then I could tell my cousins about that. I have very, very many cousins. And it was really a surprise to them. And also, though, that I've discovered mistakes on the different databases when people contribute. So you have to be aware of that. If you have a hard copy, some original document, that's what you're looking for when you're doing genealogical research. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. So I have added information. So I confirm the connection with my great-grandfather, Michael Hamilton. And you can scan documents and put it in. So the picture I had of Michael and his wife, I'm going to scan that. I'm going to put it in. Eva Hamilton's image, I'm going to put it in. So if any of you folks added content, you can add it. Pictures, images, and records are better. Boarding passes is good because that's an objective record. Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the gentleman who was asked the ethical question. My own personal experience, finding a relative you didn't know about later in life can be very positive. Personal experience. And the other is, we have a story amongst us. They trace back to the Mayflower. I'm not sure why the story didn't know it. Does anybody know? We have somebody signed on the Mayflower Compact in this crowd.
Wow.
Larry Cunningham? I guess he's not here today. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have brought that story up. Anyway, that's just a quick one.
Larry Cunningham's a pilgrim. Okay, Miguel? Quick.
On 23andMe. Thank you. On 23andMe, if you give them an extra $100, they'll do a DNA analysis and tell you if you're susceptible to any genetic diseases.
Oh, that's interesting.
I guess the Ancestry doesn't do that.
That I don't know.
Okay. But anyway, so that's a very valuable piece of information if people are interested.
We're running late. How about one last question?
Okay. This is his third one. Make it quick.
Well, actually, technically my second, because you asked for the second. Well, actually, that probably won't be quick, so let's forget it, because it's a story. It's really, it's honestly a very true story that happened. The
better be good.
It is good. Only the dates have been changed because I can't remember them. Back in the 90s, I half-heartedly started doing some genealogy stuff. And after I retired, I spent a little more time doing it. I was out researching and I found some information on somebody that said he's related to Aladdin. Now, I know I'm related to Aladdin, and we'll get to that. But this person said he's related to Aladdin, and since I am, I figured he must be related to me. And we just couldn't figure out how. Now, my name is a Russian name that was transcribed by the clerks on the boat from the Russian alphabet into a German alphabet because you had to write something on the ship manifest that's legible, and it couldn't be in Russian. So my name is really a transliteration of from Russian. So anyway, his name wasn't, but his wife's name was, same as mine. We had to be related somehow, I figured at that time, but didn't know how. But he says he's related to Aladdin, so I sent back an email, said, well, how is this, how are you related to Aladdin? He said, well, it's really not me, it's my wife, and it's a family story that we're related to Aladdin. Do you have any? And I said, do you have any evidence? He said, no, I don't. Okay, so I said, fine. We went on from that, and years later, I did some checking and I did some research following that family, because again, they had the same last name as me. They were Jewish, and they came from Denver. Now, why Denver? I had no idea of family in Denver. I only knew about family in New York and Philadelphia at the time, but Denver, who knows? So anyway, I was doing some research, finally came up with, their background, same place in Eastern Europe, whatever, must be related. So I contacted them again. This was, maybe 10 years ago or so. And I asked him, if I could, to get information. He said, well, my wife has passed away and I don't have really any more. But her brother was around, and I suggested, well, can we get a DNA test? Can we get a DNA test from the brother? Sure enough, we got one and found out, yes, two of us are related through DNA. We have yet to find a paper trail, but related. So I said, yes, your wife was related to Aladdin. Now, how could we be related to Aladdin? Well, if you go back to the Disney movie, Aladdin, the voice of Aladdin was Scott Weinger. Scott's grandfather was my uncle.
Okay, that's the ultimate family secret. So,
thank you very much. That was a great program, and it brought out a lot of really strong personal things. Next week, I'll have a certificate, but no orchids. Gentlemen, is there anything more to be said? Then let us enjoy this wonderful day.